Welcome to Reading the Gospels together for Thursday, August the 27th. And today we're reading Acts chapter 18, where Paul makes his way to Corinth, a city he would call home for a year and a half. Now, when Paul left Athens, seemingly for once on his own steam and not outrunning a mob, he went to Corinth, about 75 kilometers away. Now, Corinth was a very important city, and a map of Greece will tell you why. It was a bit of a Panama Canal between two major parts of Greece, the central Greece mainland where Athens is located, and a vast island called the Peloponnese. Even before a canal was dug, small ships could be brought over land on a road, and larger ships could have their goods transported across the isthmus to the other side, saving days or weeks of sailing. The city was rebuilt by Julius Caesar in 44 AD as a Roman colony, and Corinth was, in the days of Paul, a meeting place for sailors and merchants and tradesfolk from far and wide, boasting a population of over 100,000, including a major temple to Aphrodite, the goddess of fertility and love, staffed with 1,000 prostitutes. Perhaps not the first place you would think of to establish a foothold for the faith. We're told that Paul soon met a tent-making couple, Aquila and Priscilla. Jews had been expelled from Rome by an edict of Claudius. Now, we know when that edict happened, more or less, and that places the story somewhere around 50 to 51 AD. Here we learn that Paul was a tent maker as well, and as a fellow tradesman, he stayed and worked with Priscilla and Aquila, leading them to their conversion to the Christian faith. Now, note that Paul is on his own. He needs to support himself with his trade until a more established Christian community can provide help, freeing him for his teaching and preaching work. Now, Paul the tent maker. For a tent maker, by the way, think not only of tents, but awnings as well. For businesses and courtyards, a far more common sight in cities than tents. Canvas worker isn't a bad way to understand this in our modern context, although leather was also a common material for such items. Now, to this day, traveling in the Middle East and Asia Minor, you'll see awnings shielding buildings and marketplaces from the hot sun. They're a common sight. There may well have been a component to Paul's work which involved serving the maritime shipping industry, Corinth's main source of revenue. Eventually, Silas and Timothy make their way down to Corinth, and Paul is able, with their support, now to devote himself full-time to his ministry. Eventually, as seems to happen every time, Paul wears out his welcome in the synagogue and shifts his efforts to the Gentiles. We're told that the synagogue ruler and his entire household were nonetheless believers. Inroads are soon made into the general Corinthian population. Now, in all the other stories we've encountered, soon a mob is going to be formed and Paul will be forced to flee. Doubtless, Paul was expecting just that to happen yet again. But God sent a vision to the contrary. Do not be afraid, keep on speaking, do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one's going to attack and harm you because I have many people in this city. Now, this vision is tested when Paul's opponents establish a court case against him, but the proconsul of the province, Gallio, well-known person in other historical documents as well, a well-known legal mind. Gallio decides it's an internal religious matter, has nothing to do with him, and so Paul is able to stay a further 18 months in Corinth, establishing the communities of faith we read about and read about in Paul's letters to 1st and 2nd Corinthians. When he at last decides to move on, and it's hard not to imagine Paul with itchy feet, keen to resume his travels once again, he brings Priscilla and Aquila with him, leaving Timothy and Silas to care for the churches. And here we read a curious passage that Paul had his hair cut off at Cenchrea because of a vow that he had taken. Oh, what's going on there? Well, remember, Paul is still very much culturally a Jew. A common Jewish vow was called the Nazirite vow, where for a period of 30 days or so, the length could vary depending on the vow, a person would abstain from wine, avoid impurity of any kind, and mark the end of the period by cutting off one's hair. It's possible that Paul took such a vow in an attempt to gain clarity from God regarding his next move, ultimately to leave Corinth. And upon doing so, he brings his vow to an end. As one commentator writes, he says, Luke does not explain why Paul has taken this vow. It may have been an expression of faith and commitment to the Lord for the challenge of the new circumstances of proclaiming the gospel in Corinth in the midst of heavy opposition. It may also have been a way for Paul to express his thanksgiving to God for his hand of blessing on the Corinthian ministry and for keeping him safe, just as God has promised to do in the vision. The passage clearly shows that Paul does not abandon Jewish traditions altogether. He finds this form helpful to express his devotion and commitment to the Lord. It's interesting that nowhere does Paul instruct others or us to do the same. There is no tradition of the Nazirite vow in the church, but for some people, observing times of sacrifice like Lent, for instance, where you give things up for a period of time as a spiritual discipline, are still practiced in the church. Now, traveling through Ephesus, Paul decides to leave Priscilla and Aquila there in Ephesus to establish a ministry of their own. Curiously, as an aside, both Luke and Paul almost always refer to them as Priscilla and Aquila, with Priscilla's name first, a possible indication that in terms of the Christian faith, she was the more prominent of the two. Promising to eventually return, Paul boards ship and returns to Israel via Caesarea. He visits Jerusalem. He eventually returns to the home base of Antioch, and then, in an astonishing bit of shorthand by Luke, after spending some time in Antioch, Paul set out from there and traveled from place to place throughout the region of Galatia and Phrygia, strengthening all the disciples. That's a missionary journey of considerable extent, about which we know nothing at all. See, Luke's attention is back in Ephesus, where he introduces us to yet another new character in our story, Apollos, an Alexandrian Christian, so from the coast of North Africa, and a notable preacher in his own right. Interestingly, we read, he'd been instructed in the way of the Lord, and he spoke with great fervor and taught about Jesus accurately, though he knew only the baptism of John. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue, and when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they invited him to their home and explained to him the way of God more adequately. So we occasionally run into those who've been baptized through the ministry of John the Baptist, who then become Christian, but who are not yet baptized into the Christian faith. Priscilla and Aquila fill Apollos in on the points of the Christian faith where he was somehow lacking. And we'll meet Apollos again in Paul's letters when when Apollos leaving Turkey for Greece becomes an unintended rival to Paul in the Corinthian church. But that's for another day. So the faith is spreading with faithful men and women leading the way, and Paul will return to his friends Priscilla and Aquila in Ephesus in chapter 19. Be sure to read chapter 19 before watching tomorrow's video, as there's lots going on and it's exciting stuff. We'll see you then.